Cold millionaire CEO enters contract marriage with a black wife. Love breaks every clause. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Ethan Caldwell stood alone behind the glass walls of the 48th floor, where Manhattan looked smaller than the spreadsheets glowing on his desk. At 38, he was known across boardrooms and financial pages as a disciplined, cold, and exacting millionaire CEO, a man who measured risk in decimals and trust in clauses. His tailored navy suit fit like armor, pressed sharp enough to cut through doubt, and his posture never betrayed hesitation. The morning sun reflected off steel and glass, casting clean lines across the room, a geometry he preferred to the unpredictable shapes of emotion. On the desk lay a contract printed on thick paper, its margins wide, its language precise, each paragraph drafted to control outcomes the way he controlled markets. This was not a romance, not even a compromise, it was a solution. The board wanted stability, the family foundation wanted appearances, and the press wanted a story that would quiet speculation. Marriage, in this case, was a structure, and Ethan believed structures only worked when every joint was reinforced. When the door opened quietly, he did not look up at first. He heard measured footsteps, unhurried, confident in their own rhythm. Naomi Brooks entered the room with a composure that did not ask for permission. She wore a simple charcoal dress, elegant without display, and carried herself with a stillness that drew the eye without demanding it. Her presence did not soften the room, it clarified it. Ethan finally raised his gaze, expecting nerves, calculation, or curiosity, but found none of those. Naomi's expression was calm, her eyes steady, as if she had already weighed the cost of this agreement and decided that dignity would not be among the expenses. She had read the brief, understood the expectations, and accepted the reality without illusion. To Ethan, she was an answer to a problem, a variable that completed an equation, yet something in the way she stood, shoulders relaxed, chin level, unsettled his certainty. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and she sat with the same quiet assurance, placing her hands neatly on the table. The city hummed beyond the glass, distant sirens threading through traffic far below, but inside the office there was only the low, controlled cadence of a deal about to be made. Ethan explained the purpose in terms that avoided sentiment, speaking of timelines, public engagements, and boundaries, his voice even and professional. Naomi listened without interruption, her attention focused, absorbing every word. When he finished, he slid the contract across the desk, the paper stopping perfectly aligned with the edge. For a moment, neither moved. It was not tension that filled the space, but gravity, the sense that something permanent was being assembled from clean lines and quiet choices. Naomi reached for the pen, not hurried, not reluctant, and Ethan realized that this marriage would begin exactly as he intended, with control, clarity, and rules that left no room for love, or so he believed as the ink prepared to meet the page. The contract was finalized within 48 hours, notarized, archived, and announced with the same efficiency Ethan Caldwell applied to quarterly earnings calls, and by the time the press release circulated, the marriage already existed as a fact rather than a feeling. The legal team walked Naomi Brooks through the clauses in a private conference room overlooking the East River, the water below moving freely in a way that contrasted sharply with the language on the page. The terms were clear, unemotional, and deliberate. Public appearances scheduled in advance, shared residence defined by separate wings of the penthouse, financial independence guaranteed, privacy protected, and emotional expectations explicitly excluded. There would be no public displays beyond what was required, no personal interference, no assumption of affection, and no claim beyond what was written in ink. Naomi listened without flinching as if the rules were simply weather conditions to be acknowledged rather than obstacles to be feared. When questions were invited, she asked only for clarification, never negotiation, her voice steady, her posture relaxed, as though dignity itself had been written into her spine. Ethan observed from the far end of the table, hands folded, expression neutral, impressed despite himself by her composure, because most people in that room eventually revealed a need to be reassured, and Naomi did not. After the meeting, they traveled together for the first time, seated side by side in the back of a black sedan moving through midtown traffic, the city lights reflecting against the windows like distant stars neither of them reached for. The silence between them was not awkward, only precise, the silence of two people who understood that this arrangement depended on restraint. At the penthouse, staff had been discreetly instructed, names memorized, routines adjusted, and when Naomi was shown to her living space, she thanked them quietly, without ceremony, noticing how respect shifted when it was neither demanded nor refused. Later that evening, Ethan reviewed emails while Naomi unpacked a single suitcase, folding her clothes carefully into a closet that looked untouched, her movements unhurried, her breathing even. There was no sense of arrival, no sense of conquest, only transition. At dinner, served promptly at 7, they sat across a long table that felt intentionally oversized, the distance between them mirroring the understanding they had signed into existence. Ethan spoke about schedules and expectations, about upcoming charity events and board functions, outlining responsibilities as if assigning tasks at work. Naomi listened, nodded, and responded when necessary, never defensive, never submissive, offering confirmation rather than commentary. When the conversation ended, she thanked him for the clarity, a simple phrase that lingered longer than he expected, because clarity was his currency, yet hearing it acknowledged felt unexpectedly personal. That night, as Ethan stood alone in his office once more, contracts secured, variables controlled, he told himself the system was flawless, because nothing about it required vulnerability, and nothing about it asked for love, and in the quiet certainty of that belief, he did not yet recognize that the very precision he relied on would soon be challenged by a woman who followed every rule without ever becoming one. Life inside the penthouse settled into a rhythm that felt efficient but incomplete, like a machine running without friction yet producing an unfamiliar sound. And it was within this quiet coexistence that the first true collision occurred. Mornings began early for Ethan Caldwell, who reviewed market reports before sunrise, his coffee measured, his schedule immovable, and Naomi Brooks adapted without comment, timing her movements so they never intersected unless required. She exercised in the smaller living room while he worked. She prepared her own breakfast when he hosted meetings, and when they crossed paths, their exchanges were polite, brief, and carefully neutral. Yet control, Ethan discovered, did not guarantee comfort. Naomi's presence did not disrupt his routine, but it altered the atmosphere, introducing a stillness that could not be quantified. She moved through shared spaces without hesitation, not as a guest, and not as an intruder, and the staff responded to her with a respect that was quiet and sincere. Ethan noticed it during a charity planning meeting held in the penthouse, when an assistant instinctively looked to Naomi for confirmation before leaving the room, and Naomi simply nodded, offering a calm smile that carried neither authority nor apology. The moment was small, but it lingered. Later that evening, as rain streaked against the windows and city lights blurred into reflections, Ethan outlined expectations for an upcoming gala, speaking in the same tone he used with executives, assuming efficiency would translate to compliance. Naomi listened, then responded with a single observation about accessibility and timing, noting how certain guests might feel excluded by the schedule. Her comment was not a challenge, merely an insight, but it disrupted his certainty because it addressed people rather than optics. Ethan paused, surprised by the precision of her awareness, and for the first time since signing the contract, he felt the urge to reconsider a plan rather than enforce it. The next day, tension surfaced in subtler ways, through differences that could not be corrected by clauses. Ethan preferred silence, while Naomi allowed music to play softly in the evenings, not loud enough to intrude, but present enough to change the air. He favored meals prepared by staff, while she occasionally cooked for herself, filling the kitchen with unfamiliar spices and warmth that made the space feel lived in rather than staged. He did not ask questions, yet he found himself noticing details, the way she thanked everyone by name, the way she paused before entering a room as if acknowledging its history. The collision was not an argument or a raised voice, but a growing awareness that coexistence was not neutrality. One afternoon, returning early from the office, Ethan found Naomi in the main living area reviewing documents for a foundation event, her notes meticulous, her focus absolute. She looked up briefly, acknowledged him, and returned to her work without waiting for approval, and something in that moment unsettled him more than defiance ever could. She was fulfilling the contract perfectly, yet she was not invisible, and that realization introduced a discomfort he could not file away. Ethan had built his life on predictability, on the belief that people behaved according to incentives and rules, and Naomi Brooks did neither. She followed every agreement without shrinking herself to fit it, and in that quiet contradiction, the first fracture appeared, not in the contract itself, but in Ethan's conviction that control was the same as understanding. The gala arrived on a clear autumn evening, staged inside a restored Manhattan landmark where marble floors reflected chandeliers, and the air carried a quiet confidence reserved for people who expected to belong. Ethan Caldwell arrived precisely on schedule, his presence commanding without effort, every detail aligned with expectation, and Naomi Brooks walked beside him with the same calm composure she carried everywhere, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. Cameras flashed briefly, capturing the image the board wanted, a powerful CEO and his elegant wife. Yet as they moved deeper into the room, Ethan felt a subtle shift he could not name. Conversations flowed around them, polite and polished, but beneath the surface, glances lingered on Naomi a fraction longer than necessary, curiosity thinly veiled as interest, judgment disguised as fascination. Ethan noticed the way certain smiles tightened when Naomi spoke, how compliments carried a hint of surprise, as if her confidence required explanation. Naomi noticed too, but she did not slow her step or soften her presence. She greeted donors and executives with the same courtesy she offered staff, listening fully, responding thoughtfully, never attempting to impress. At one point, as Ethan was drawn into a discussion about expansion strategies, Naomi stood slightly apart, engaged by a small group discussing community outreach, her voice steady, her insights precise. A remark was made, subtle enough to be excused as harmless, about how refreshing it was to see diversity represented so gracefully, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any insult. Naomi did not react immediately. She smiled once, thanked the speaker for their perspective, and redirected the conversation toward the foundation's goals, grounding it in purpose rather than personal identity. The moment passed, but Ethan felt it land. For the first time, he was aware of a tension he had never experienced, not directed at him, but standing beside him. He watched Naomi continue through the evening with quiet dignity, answering questions without defensiveness, declining assumptions without confrontation, her restraint revealing strength rather than submission. When a donor later praised Ethan for his choice, implying the marriage was a strategic move that reflected well on his brand, Ethan hesitated before responding, a pause so brief it went unnoticed by everyone but himself. He realized that until that moment, he had accepted that interpretation as accurate, even logical, and now it felt insufficient. As the evening wound down and the crowd thinned, Ethan and Naomi stood near the tall windows overlooking the city, the lights below forming a pattern that mirrored the grid lines he trusted. Naomi spoke softly, commenting on how the event would impact the communities it aimed to serve, her focus outward, never personal. Ethan listened, not as a CEO evaluating input, but as a man recognizing something he had not accounted for. She had been treated as an accessory, a symbol, and she had responded not by demanding correction, but by demonstrating value so clearly that dismissal became impossible. Driving home, the silence in the car felt different, charged not with distance, but with awareness. Ethan realized that the contract had not prepared him for this, for the discomfort of witnessing dignity tested and upheld without his intervention. That night, standing alone once more in his office, he reviewed the same contract he had once believed flawless, and for the first time, he recognized a weakness, not in the language, but in himself, because something essential had been revealed, and no clause had anticipated the quiet power of a woman who refused to be diminished. In the days following the gala, Something subtle but irreversible shifted between Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Brooks. Not through conversation, but through attention. Ethan began to notice her in ways that were not required by the contract. The quiet routines she maintained, the discipline that mirrored his own yet expressed itself differently. She rose early, not to be seen, but because she valued order, and he found her already awake when he passed the living room before sunrise, reading with a cup of tea, the city still dim beyond the windows. She did not attempt to engage him, nor did she retreat, simply acknowledging his presence with a calm nod that carried neither expectation nor distance. At the office, Ethan caught himself replaying moments from the gala. The way Naomi had redirected conversation without embarrassment, the way she had protected her dignity without demanding protection. It unsettled him because it revealed a form of strength he had never learned to measure. During a foundation meeting later that week, he surprised his own team by asking Naomi to attend, not as a formality, but as a participant. She listened carefully, offering insights grounded in lived experience rather than projections, and the room responded with an attentiveness that shifted the tone entirely. Ethan observed how people leaned in when she spoke, not because of who she was married to, but because of the clarity she brought. That evening, back at the penthouse, Ethan found himself lingering in shared spaces, no longer timing his movements to avoid overlap. Naomi prepared a simple meal for herself, the scent warm and unfamiliar, and without planning to, Ethan joined her at the kitchen counter. The conversation that followed unforced, practical, and unexpectedly comfortable. They spoke about schedules, about commitments, about the city, and then, briefly, about childhood memories, the exchange tentative but genuine. There was no crossing of boundaries, no violation of terms, yet something real unfolded in the space between words. Ethan noticed how Naomi listened, fully, without interrupting, without strategizing, a contrast to the competitive dialogues he navigated daily. In her presence, he felt no need to perform or assert, and that realization disturbed him more than conflict ever had. Over the next week, he adjusted small things, moving meetings to accommodate her foundation work, correcting assumptions made by staff without explanation, ensuring her voice was not overlooked. These were not grand gestures, but they were intentional, and Naomi noticed, not with gratitude, but with recognition. She did not thank him excessively or alter her behavior, and that steadiness held him accountable in ways he did not expect. One evening, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the city, the lights stretching for miles, Ethan acknowledged, quietly, that the arrangement was evolving beyond his initial calculations. Naomi did not respond immediately. She looked out at the skyline, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, and said only that she had always understood the terms, but that respect was not something that could be scheduled. The words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Alone later that night, Ethan reviewed the contract once more, the clauses unchanged, the ink permanent, yet the meaning altered. He realized that somewhere between observation and awareness, the pretense had begun to turn real, not because rules were broken, but because something unspoken had been allowed to exist, and for the first time, he wondered whether control had been his greatest limitation. The crisis arrived without warning, disguised as professionalism and delivered through polished language. When Ethan Caldwell was summoned to an unscheduled board meeting on a gray morning that made the city feel distant and impersonal. The agenda was framed as routine, yet the undertone was unmistakable, questions about optics, stability, and influence circling the table with careful precision. Naomi Brooks was not mentioned by name at first, but her presence hovered in every implication, every pause that followed a sentence about legacy and perception. A senior board member remarked that public narratives were shifting, that certain donors were expressing discomfort, and that while the marriage had initially stabilized confidence, it was now attracting scrutiny that could not be ignored. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression controlled, but something tightened in his chest when the discussion turned to appearances rather than values. Later that day, headlines surfaced online, subtle at first, then sharper, articles speculating about motives, questioning authenticity, framing Naomi as a symbol rather than a person. None of it was overt, yet the implications were clear, and Ethan recognized the familiar strategy of distancing responsibility through suggestion. When he returned to the penthouse that evening, Naomi was already aware, not because she searched for validation, but because she understood how narratives traveled. She met him in the living room with the same calm she always carried, acknowledging the situation without accusation, stating simply that she had anticipated resistance. Her composure unsettled him more than anger would have, because it forced him to confront his own hesitation. Over the following days, pressure intensified. Invitations were withdrawn, meetings postponed, and advisors urged discretion, recommending that Naomi limit her public presence until attention shifted. Ethan found himself repeating these suggestions, not as commands, but as options, and each time he spoke them aloud, they sounded hollow. Naomi listened, then responded with clarity, explaining that she would not disappear to make others comfortable, nor would she create conflict where none was necessary. She reminded him that the contract guaranteed autonomy, and she intended to honor it fully. Her words were measured, but they drew a line he could not ignore. The true fracture came during a foundation event when a sponsor requested a private conversation with Ethan, implying that continued support depended on maintaining a certain image. Ethan realized in that moment that silence would be interpreted as agreement. An agreement would be a betrayal, not of Naomi alone, but of the man he believed himself to be. That night, tension filled the penthouse, not loud, but heavy, as Ethan paced his office while Naomi prepared documents for her own work, both aware that a decision was approaching. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice carried a restraint that barely contained urgency, explaining the stakes, the risks, the consequences of defiance. Naomi listened, then asked him one question, quiet and direct, about whether he wanted her to remain only when convenient. The question struck deeper than any accusation, because it forced him to confront the gap between his intentions and his actions. Ethan realized that the contract had provided him with an excuse to avoid responsibility, and now it was demanding a choice. As he stood there, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, he understood that this was the moment he had been avoiding, the point where neutrality was no longer possible. The crisis was not about reputation or influence, but about alignment, and for the first time, Ethan recognized that preserving control might cost him something far more significant than approval. The realization came quietly, without ceremony, on a morning when Ethan Caldwell chose to cancel a standing call with his advisors and remain in the penthouse longer than usual, watching the city wake beneath a low blanket of clouds. He stood at the window as traffic gathered below, recognizing a familiar pattern, movement driven by urgency rather than purpose. And for the first time, he saw himself reflected in it. Naomi Brooks was in the adjacent room, reviewing notes for a community initiative that had drawn increasing attention despite the resistance surrounding it, her focus steady, her presence grounded. Ethan realized that while he had been calculating outcomes, she had been living principles, and the contrast unsettled him. When he finally spoke, it was not to discuss optics or strategy, but to acknowledge what he had been avoiding, that he had allowed convenience to dictate his silence. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression composed, but her eyes attentive, and when he paused, she did not fill the space with reassurance. Instead, she waited, allowing the weight of his words to remain his responsibility. Ethan admitted that he had believed neutrality was professionalism, that withholding public support was a way to protect both of them, yet he now understood that inaction was not protection but permission. The admission felt unfamiliar, stripping away the armor he had relied on for years, and he recognized that this discomfort was necessary. Later that day, during a rescheduled board call, Ethan spoke with a clarity that surprised even himself, addressing concerns directly, rejecting implications that framed Naomi as a liability, and affirming that the Foundation's direction would not be altered to appease prejudice disguised as prudence. The response was immediate, silence replacing objection, and while agreement was not unanimous, the line had been drawn. When the call ended, Ethan felt no triumph, only a strange sense of alignment, as if something long misaligned had shifted into place. That evening, he joined Naomi on the terrace as dusk settled over the city, the skyline softened by fading light. He told her what he had done, not as a declaration of loyalty, but as a statement of fact, and he acknowledged that the contract had given him an excuse to remain distant when engagement was required. Naomi considered his words carefully before responding, her voice calm, explaining that she had never needed defense, only honesty, and that respect could not be partial. Ethan absorbed this without defensiveness, understanding that realization did not grant absolution, only responsibility. In that moment, he recognized that the marriage had already changed him, not through obligation, but through exposure to a standard he had not known he lacked. He no longer viewed Naomi as a variable to manage or a symbol to present, but as a person whose integrity challenged him to become more than he had planned to be. As night settled and the city lights brightened below, Ethan understood that this was the point of no return, where the arrangement ceased to be a performance and became a choice. And for the first time, he did not consider the cost, only the necessity of standing fully where he had once stood halfway. The redemption did not arrive as a public announcement or a dramatic reversal, but as a deliberate act carried out on an ordinary morning when the city moved on unaware. Ethan Caldwell sat alone at his desk, the same contract before him that had once represented certainty, its pages now worn from repeated review. The clauses were unchanged, the language still precise, yet he read them with different eyes, recognizing how they had shielded him from accountability rather than providing structure. Naomi Brooks was in the penthouse, preparing for a meeting with community partners, her focus steady, her confidence no longer questioned by anyone who truly listened. Ethan realized that while he had begun to stand beside her publicly, something remained unresolved in private, a boundary he had allowed to remain because it felt safer. He called Naomi into the office without urgency, and when she entered, he did not gesture to the contract immediately. Instead, he spoke plainly, acknowledging that the agreement had served its purpose but had also limited the truth of what existed between them. He admitted that he had hidden behind its terms when clarity demanded commitment, and that continuing to do so would be a failure of integrity. Naomi listened, her expression thoughtful, neither hopeful nor guarded, and she did not interrupt as he continued. Ethan slid the contract across the desk, not for her signature, but for her understanding, and stated that he no longer wanted their marriage governed by clauses designed to avoid feeling. He told her that if she chose to remain, it would be without conditions, without schedules, without performance, and if she chose to leave, he would respect that choice fully. The moment was quiet, absent of persuasion, and for the first time, Ethan did not attempt to manage the outcome. Naomi studied the document, her fingers resting lightly on the paper, and then she looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm that carried weight. She explained that she had never expected rescue or declaration, only honesty, and that what he was offering now was not security, but vulnerability. She reminded him that dignity required consistency, not promises, and that redemption was measured by action sustained over time. Ethan accepted this without defensiveness, understanding that the act of releasing control did not earn trust automatically. With deliberate care, he took the contract back, folded it once, and placed it aside, not torn in anger, but set down as something completed. The gesture was simple, yet it altered the room entirely, as if air had been allowed to move freely. Later that day, Ethan accompanied Naomi to her meeting, not as a figurehead, but as a participant who listened more than he spoke, reinforcing her leadership without overshadowing it. Observers noted the shift, not because it was announced, but because it was evident in his posture, his attention, his restraint. That evening, as they returned home, the penthouse felt different, no longer divided by designated spaces, but unified by choice. Ethan understood that redemption was not a single decision, but a commitment to alignment, and for the first time, he welcomed the uncertainty that came with it, because it was real, and because it was shared. The marriage did not announce itself again with headlines or ceremonies, but settled into truth through continuity, revealed in mornings that unfolded without scripts and evenings that no longer required distance. Months passed, marked not by public approval but by quiet consistency, as Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Brooks built something unmeasured by contracts or expectation. The penthouse became a shared space rather than a divided one, its rooms reflecting choice instead of arrangement, and the city beyond the windows no longer felt like a stage. Ethan adjusted not because he was asked to, but because alignment had become instinctive, his decisions shaped by consideration rather than control. Naomi continued her work with the same composure that had always defined her, never altering her principles to suit comfort, and Ethan found himself learning through observation, recognizing that partnership required presence rather than dominance. At a foundation event held months later, no longer surrounded by speculation, Naomi spoke with authority earned through action, and Ethan stood beside her without posture or performance, his support evident in restraint rather than declaration. Those who attended noted the shift, not because it was explained, but because it was visible in how they moved together, unhurried, attentive, equal. Later, alone on the terrace overlooking the city, Ethan reflected on the path that had led them there, understanding that the most significant change had occurred internally, where certainty had given way to awareness. Naomi joined him, not seeking validation, but sharing the moment, and in the quiet that followed, there was no need to define what they had become. Their conversations now carried depth without urgency, shaped by trust built through repetition rather than promise. Ethan no longer measured success solely through outcomes, having learned that integrity required patience, and Naomi no longer carried the burden of proving her worth, because it had never been conditional. When asked privately if the marriage had been what he expected, Ethan answered honestly, acknowledging that it had surpassed calculation and challenged assumption, and when Naomi was asked what had changed, she spoke simply of respect sustained over time. There was no grand closing chapter, no dramatic finale, only continuity, the rarest and most enduring form of resolution. On an ordinary morning, sunlight filled the penthouse as the city moved below, and Ethan watched Naomi prepare for the day with the same calm confidence she had always carried. He realized that love, in its truest form, had not broken rules through force or passion, but through consistency, dismantling clauses by rendering them unnecessary. What remained was not a victory over structure, but the quiet triumph of choice, renewed daily without obligation. And in that shared understanding, their story found its ending, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning defined by dignity, clarity, and a bond that no longer required definition.